Jimule Pacquiao stepped quietly into Judge Frank Caprio's courtroom, holding a small traffic ticket in his hand. It wasn't a major case, just a minor violation involving a misunderstood parking sign, but to Jimule, it still felt serious. He respected the law, and he respected the people who upheld it. As he walked toward the defendant's podium, he carried himself humbly, avoiding unnecessary attention. Nobody in the courtroom had the slightest idea who he really was. He stood straight, hands folded politely, his expression calm but clearly nervous. Despite coming from a world-famous family, he wasn't used to standing before a judge. He glanced around briefly. The courtroom was busy, as usual, locals waiting for their turn, officers filing paperwork, and Judge Caprio finishing up with the previous case when Jimule's name was called. Judge Frank Caprio looked up from his bench with his signature, warm smile. "Good morning," the judge greeted, his tone gentle and welcoming. "How are you today?" Jimule nodded, respectfully. "Good morning, Your Honor. I'm doing well, thank you." To anyone watching, he looked like just another young man trying to handle a minor issue. Judge Caprio treated him the same way he treated everyone, fairly, kindly, and with genuine interest. Nobody suspected that this polite young defendant carried one of the most recognizable last names in the sports world. As Jimule prepared to explain why he received the ticket, the atmosphere in the courtroom was completely ordinary. But that was about to change. There are moments in Judge Caprio's courtroom when things shift suddenly. Moments when a simple case becomes something far more memorable. Today would be one of those moments. Audience hook. But when Judge Caprio learned who was standing before him, the entire courtroom went silent. Judge Caprio began the hearing with his usual calm professionalism. "All right, Jimule, let's take a look at what brings you here today." Jimule respectfully explained the situation. He had parked near a loading zone, believing it was allowed during certain hours. The sign was confusing, and by the time he returned, the ticket was already tucked under his windshield wiper. He didn't argue with the officer, didn't raise his voice, and didn't blame anyone. He simply accepted the ticket and decided to appear in court to clarify the misunderstanding. As he spoke, Judge Caprio noticed something unusual not in Jimule's case, but in his character. The young man spoke gently, choosing his words carefully. His tone wasn't defensive or irritated. Instead, he carried a quiet humility that stood out. "Did you feel the sign was unclear?" the judge asked. "Yes, Your Honor," Jimule replied, his hands still neatly folded. "But I also understand that it's my responsibility to read it properly. I might have misinterpreted it." His answer surprised a few people in the courtroom. Many defendants blamed the city, the officer, or the sign itself. But Jimule took accountability without hesitation. Judge Caprio leaned slightly forward. "You seem like a very respectful young man. Where are you from?" Jimule hesitated briefly, not to hide anything, but out of modesty. "I'm originally from the Philippines, Your Honor." Caprio nodded. "Beautiful country. And you're here for school?" "Work." "School," Jimule answered softly. The judge glanced at him with a little more curiosity. "Your parents must be proud of you. You carry yourself very well." Jimule smiled politely. "Thank you, Your Honor. They always taught me to stay respectful." As the hearing continued, the audience began noticing something special about this young man. It was rare to see someone so calm, so grounded, especially someone his age. Judge Caprio clearly felt it too. He wasn't just listening to a case anymore, he was learning about the person standing before him. Engagement break. Have you ever met someone who impressed you with just their humility? Comment, yes. If you believe, respect always wins. Judge Caprio closed the file gently and looked up at Jimule with growing interest. "Tell me more about yourself," he said. "You mentioned your parents taught you about respect. What do they do?" Jimule took a slow breath. He never liked leading with his father's fame. It wasn't something he used to impress people. It was simply part of his life, one he carried quietly. "My father is involved in sports," Jimule answered. "Oh, what sport?" "Boxing, Your Honor." A few people in the courtroom raised their eyebrows. Boxing was a big sport, especially for Filipinos, but the room still didn't connect the dots. Judge Caprio nodded. "A tough sport, requires discipline." "Yes, Your Honor. He taught me a lot about discipline, about hard work, about staying grounded." The judge noticed the sincerity in Jimule's voice. "And your mother?" "She's been a strong influence in my life as well," Jimule said. "They both taught me to stay humble, no matter what." Caprio smiled. "That's a beautiful lesson. Many young people could use that today." As they continued talking, Jimule opened up more not about fame, but about values. He spoke about growing up watching his parents work tirelessly. He talked about the importance of respecting people at every level, whether they were celebrities, workers, teachers, or strangers on the street. He talked about how his father always reminded him that strength means nothing without kindness. Judge Caprio had heard hundreds of stories in his courtroom, stories of hardship, stories of struggle, stories of failure and redemption. But this one felt different. This wasn't a young man relying on privilege. This wasn't someone expecting special treatment. This was someone who understood responsibility. So what are your goals? Caprio asked gently. I want to make my own path, Jamil said. My family name carries a lot of weight, but I want to earn things through my own effort. I never want to rely on who my father is. The courtroom suddenly felt different, quieter, more emotional. People listened closely, surprised by such maturity. Judge Caprio nodded slowly, visibly moved. You know, not everyone with a famous background thinks like that. Jamil lowered his head modestly. I don't want to disappoint my parents, Your Honor. They came from very simple beginnings. They've worked so hard. I want to honor that. There was a pause. A meaningful one. Even the officers in the courtroom seemed touched. Jim Uel wasn't here as Manny Pacquiao's son. He was here as Jamil, a young man standing on his own character. Judge Caprio adjusted his glasses slightly, studying the young man before him. Something about Jamil's answers, his calm tone, and his respectful presence made the judge even more curious. You mentioned your father is a boxer, Caprio said, leaning back thoughtfully. Boxing is a big sport, and the Philippines has produced some of the greatest fighters in the world. Jamil nodded politely. Yes, Your Honor. Caprio's eyes narrowed, not in suspicion, but in recognition. A thought passed through his mind, and for the first time, he looked at Jamil with a deeper sense of familiarity. He tilted his head. Tell me, what is your father's name? Jamil hesitated, not out of fear, but out of his natural humility. He rarely introduced himself by association, but he also didn't want to line out in front of a judge he genuinely respected. With a small, almost shy smile, he answered, My father is Manny Pacquiao, Your Honor. The courtroom reaction was instant. A soft wave of whispers rushed across the benches. That's Manny Pacquiao's son? No way. The boxing legend. He's so humble. Even the officers exchanged surprised glances. A few people, silently, reached for their phones, resisting the urge to record out of respect for the court. Judge Caprio blinked slowly. Manny Pacquiao, the world champion. Yes, Your Honor, Jamil replied with quiet confidence, lowering his head respectfully. Caprio chuckled softly, amazed. Well, Jamil, that certainly explains the discipline I'm seeing here. Jamil didn't brag. He didn't smile widely or take pride in the recognition. Instead, he stood even straighter, still humble, still grounded. I'm just here to take responsibility, Your Honor, he said gently. Caprio admired that. Many people with famous last names walked into court expecting to be treated differently, but Jamil, he wanted none of that. You know, the judge said, your father is admired across the world, not just for his success, but for his humility. Jamil nodded. He always told me, respect is more important than victory. The courtroom softened. People weren't starstruck anymore, they were touched. This wasn't a spoiled celebrity, son. This was a young man shaped by true values. You've made quite an impression here today, Caprio said warmly, and he meant it. Judge Caprio leaned forward, resting his hands gently on the bench. The discovery of Jamil's identity didn't change the legal process, but it certainly added emotional weight. You know, Caprio began, I remember watching your father fight. Not just in the ring, but outside of it, how he helped people, how he stayed humble, even when he became one of the greatest of all time. Jamil listened with respect. Grateful but not boastful. I've met many people in this courtroom, Caprio continued. Some come from difficult circumstances, some from privilege, but what matters to me is character. He paused briefly, letting the words sink in. And I must say, your father must be incredibly proud. Not because you told me who he is, but because of how you carry yourself. The courtroom grew emotional. A woman in the back wiped her eyes discreetly. Even the bailiff looked a bit soddened. Caprio leaned back, reflecting on his own life. My father came from very humble beginnings. He said, he taught me that no matter where life takes you, you must never forget where you started. He glanced at Jamil with warmth in his eyes. That same spirit, I see it in you. Jamil felt his chest tighten slightly. He wasn't used to compliments, especially not ones that cut so deeply. Thank you, Your Honor, he said with genuine emotion. That means a lot. Caprio smiled. Your father fought battles inside the ring, but you are fighting a different kind. You're proving that fame doesn't define you. Character does. Jamil swallowed, humbled by the judge's words. You know, Caprio said reflectively, your father's journey from poverty to becoming a world champion, it reminds us all that greatness often rises from nothing. And when I look at you, I see someone who hasn't forgotten that. The courtroom was silent, completely silent. No cameras, no cheering crowds, no boxing lights, just a judge and a young man sharing a moment of raw humanity. And it moved everyone who witnessed it. Judge Caprio picked up the citation again, glancing at the details one last time. Now, let's talk about your case. Jimule nodded respectfully. Based on the circumstances, Caprio said, I can see how the sign may have been confusing, and given your honesty, your politeness, and your willingness to accept responsibility, I'm inclined to dismiss this ticket. There was a soft stir of relief and gratitude from Jimule. But Caprio wasn't finished. Before I close this case, he said gently, I want to say something not just to you, but to everyone listening. The courtroom quieted again. In life, Caprio said, we all make mistakes, but it's how we face them that defines us. Humility, respect, responsibility, those are qualities that create true greatness. He looked directly at Jimule. And you, young man, have all of them. Jimule lowered his head reverently. Thank you so much, Your Honor. Caprio smiled warmly. I hope you continue living with these values. The world needs more young people like you. Jimule nodded, deeply grateful. I'll never forget this moment, Your Honor. And he meant it. The interaction didn't stay in the courtroom for long. Within days, the clip of Jimule Pacquiao standing before Judge Frank Caprio went viral across social media. Not because people recognized Manny Pacquiao's son at first, but because of the heartfelt conversation between a wise judge and a humble young man. Clips circulated with captions like, humility is power. This generation needs more Jimules. Judge Caprio always brings out the best in people. Millions commented on how refreshing it was to see someone raised in the spotlight, carry them all themselves with such grace. People from the Philippines flooded the comments with pride. Americans admired the values Jimule represented. Boxing fans celebrated Manny Pacquiao, not for his titles, but for the kind of son he raised. But above all, the world admired the moment of pure respect between two generations, one young, one seasoned, meeting in the middle, sharing wisdom and humility. Final call to action. If you believe true greatness comes from humility, type humble in the comments and subscribe for more inspiring stories like this.